Chicago Public Schools, a focus on English language learners. As you can see, we have an exciting set of presentations today, led off by Jennifer O'Day, a leading researcher and ELLs expert from AIR. She is joined by the research team from the Consortium on Chicago School Research. We're honored to be joined by that team by Elaine Allensworth, who heads the consortium, and in turn the other team members, the study being led by Julia Gwen and her colleagues Amber Pareja and Stacy Ehrlich. Finally, Mindy O'Cummings, who leads our EWS work at the National High School Center, will discuss the implications of the research on EWS for ELLs. Before we begin, I'd like to share several housekeeping items. As you see on your screen, and you should see on your computer as well, on the right side of the screen, there's a comment box for you to add comments and send comments to us directly, or to pose questions that we'll answer during the Q&A session. All phone lines will be muted during this presentation, and the presentation itself will be recorded and available shortly after this webinar in the next few days. For those of you who are new to the National High School Center, we are one of 5 federally funded content centers who work through 16 regional centers to provide TA to the states, districts, and schools that they serve. In addition to dropout, our other priority topics include college and career readiness, tiered interventions, and high school improvement. Every day, every school day, nearly 7,000 or 1 in 4 students become dropouts in the U.S. Annually, that adds up to about 1.2 million students who will not graduate from high school with their peers as scheduled. Lacking a high school diploma, these individuals will be far more likely than graduates to spend their lives periodically unemployed, on government assistance, or cycling in and out of the prison system. The problem is disproportionately impacts students with disabilities and students of color. Only about 55% graduate within 4 years. As part of our dropout focus, the National High School Center adopted the consortium's early warning indicators on attendance, GPA, and course failures based on their original Staying on Track report that was published in 2005, and used these indicators to develop a series of EWS tools that are available free of charge from our website. A natural evolution of that work was for us to question how accurately these indicators and cut points applied to various subgroups of students with disabilities and English language learners. We are pleased with the consortium's receptivity to this idea and proceeded to sponsor their research, which resulted in these 2 addenda to their original reports. What Matters for Students on Track and Graduating into Chicago Public Schools, a focus on students with disabilities, that was published in December 2009, and now this other version, a focus on English language learners, that was recently published in May 2012. So let's get started with our presentations. I'd like to introduce Jennifer O'Day, who will discuss why do explore early warning indicators for English language learners. Jennifer?
Thanks, Joe. First of all, I apologize if I sneeze in the middle of this. I've been struggling with a cold, so try to do the best I can. So I think this question of why you would want to look at English learners in particular is an important one, and there are a number of reasons why this might be the case. One, of course, is just the large and increasing numbers of English language learners in secondary schools. Let me give you a few examples. In the 1990s, the secondary school English learner population grew by 64%, and this is compared to a growth of 46% in the elementary school. So we're seeing a disproportionate growth of secondary English learner students. Across the country, the secondary age EL population is about 6.5% now, but that obviously varies quite a bit by state and by districts within states. The highest concentration of English learners is California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois, but there's been tremendous growth in states that have traditionally lower populations of English learners, particularly in the Southeast, Midwest, and interwestern States. So this is an issue that crosses the nation. English learners are more likely to live in poverty and be concentrated in low-performing schools. 60% of secondary English learners are low income, which is twice as high for non-ELs, and that's according to the 2000 census reported in 2005. There's a huge diversity of EL students, which implies a variation in the kinds of needs that they have, something that I know that the folks in the consortium took a look at in their data. So, for example, you have new immigrants. High school-age children, in fact, are much more likely than younger children to be first-generation immigrants. You have SIFE students with interrupted formal education, who have a set of particular needs with respect to that and being behind other students because they've been absent from school for long periods of time. You have long-term English learners. English learners usually thought of as being classified as English learners for more than 5 years. And in this, it's important to keep in mind that half of the English learners, over half, I think, of the English learners at the high school level as well as at the elementary level are born in the United States. So they've been in U.S. schools since kindergarten or first grade. You have a great variety of languages and cultures. Slightly more than half of ELs are Latinos. About 30% are Mexican. But you have a huge diversity of languages. In New York City, for example, you have over 400 languages. In some California schools, you can have upwards of 20 languages just in a single school. You have kids who are themselves undocumented or, in many cases, the children of undocumented parents, which creates additional challenges. And all of these differences imply differences in educational needs and educational trajectories, including high school graduation. English learners, new slide, new slide, yeah. English learners face a double challenge of, this is particularly true in the secondary grades, of needing to acquire English, and for high school immigrants also acquiring socialization. With the acquisition of English, important to keep in mind, particularly in these times, the difference between social English and academic English. And for the secondary school students who have been in the system for a long time, who are born here, oftentimes they have very high degrees of social language, but they haven't necessarily acquired the kind of academic English that's necessary for success. At the same time they're learning English, of course, they have to learn content. And in many cases, especially in recent years, that content is being taught increasingly in English-only settings. You have huge attainment and achievement gaps. For example, 71% of 8th graders were below grade level compared to 25%, according to the nation's report card in 2007. You have a 30 to 40% lower passage rates on high school exit exams. You have higher dropout rates and lower enrollment rates in college. A CREST study, for example, found that in the one state where they looked for 3 years of data, that the dropout rate for English learners was 25% as compared to 15% for non-English learners. And it was even higher, 33%, if they were still English learners when they were in high school, 22% if they had been reclassified before grade 5, and if they had been reclassified in grade 2 or earlier, it was only 2%. Hispanics, many of whom are English learners, are only 7% of students entering college, though they're 17% of the high school population. In addition to these, next slide, thinking about kind of the challenges that the children face, we also have to be, obviously, keep in mind the current policy context, the great emphasis on accountability, including an increasing emphasis on graduation rates, the really stepped-up language demands of the Common Core state standards, which are being implemented in nearly all states across the country. And in fact, there is an initiative, the Understanding Language Initiative, which focuses specifically on implementation of the Common Core State Standards for English learners, and I would recommend that to folks on the webinar. And then I think it's also important to keep in mind that now we're talking much more about the demands for college and career readiness, not just high school graduation. Obviously, high school graduation is critically important, but we know that many students who graduate from high school are not necessarily adequately prepared for college and career. So I think looking at the early warning indicators for English language learners can be very important in addressing these kinds of issues. One, it can help to identify students who need additional intervention. But two, it can also help to identify areas of weakness in curriculum or instruction that can be paid attention to on a broader basis than just student by student. And they can also help to identify in the aggregate professional development needs. So with that just very kind of brief and general introduction, I'll turn it over to Julia and Elaine and the team.
Thanks, Jennifer. This is Joe. Julia and Elaine, let's get started. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. And Jennifer. Today we are going to take you through a study that we recently published looking at English language learners. As Joe mentioned earlier, this study is really a follow-up to an earlier study that highlighted the importance of ninth grade course performance for identifying students who might be on the path towards dropping out. But that study really focused on a general population of students and wasn't able to consider whether or not ninth grade course performance was as predictive of high school graduation for subgroups as it was for a general population of students. So this study, of course, is really asking that question. Is ninth grade course performance as predictive of graduation for ELLs as for the general population? So today we're going to start our presentation by first highlighting some of the findings of the previous work, and then we're going to move into our current study, and we will take you through, first of all, who we are looking at and how we are thinking about different subgroups within the ELL population. We will then look at how ELL students perform on ninth grade indicators, and then we will ask or look at whether or not ninth grade indicators work as well for ELL students as for the general population. And then lastly, we're going to briefly look at this question of whether or not there are other factors that may explain differences in graduation rates among specific subgroups of Hispanic ELLs. And I should add, although the full report looks at Hispanic ELLs, it looks at Asian ELLs, it looks at white ELLs, for the purpose of this presentation, we are focusing specifically on Hispanic students because they represent the largest group within CPS. So the rest of the data that we present will be about Hispanic students in CPS. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Elaine, who will talk about the earlier study.
Thanks, Julia. We all know that graduation is related to a lot of background characteristics. Everyone kind of knows that students with high test scores are more likely to graduate, students who are not living in poverty, girls, students who are on age per grade are more likely to graduate than students with low test scores, boys living in poverty. But what people don't realize is even though all those things are related to graduation and dropout, they're not very strongly related. And if we try to use all those things to predict who's going to graduate, which we want to do if we want to, have intervention plans for those students who are likely not to graduate, we actually can't do a really good job of identifying them because the relationships are really just not that strong. So using all that information together, in Chicago, we could really only correctly predict 65% of graduates, which is, it's better than a coin flip, but it's still not as good as we'd want it to be to dedicate resources to intervention. But using one indicator by itself, what we call the on-track indicator in ninth grade, by itself correctly predicts 80% of students. This is just a really simple indicator that's based on students' ninth grade course performance. A student is on track if they have enough credits to move on to the sophomore year, and if they've failed no more than one semester of a core course, math, English, science, or social science. Using that one indicator, we can correctly identify 80% of students and almost 3/4 of dropouts. So that one indicator by itself, much better than any of the other background information. And in fact, once we know whether a student is on track or not, all that other information doesn't tell us anything more, hardly gives us any more information about whether that student will graduate, because all of those background characteristics affect graduation by affecting students' work in their courses. So once, we don't have to pay attention to everything going on in kids' lives, which would be impossible. It's really an impossible job for schools. But what we do need to pay attention to is whether they're passing their classes in 9th grade, and making sure that we're intervening right away if they're not. Oh, it's okay. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this shows 4-year and 5-year graduation rates by whether students were on track or off track at the end of their 9th grade year. And you can see students who are on track are about 4 times more likely to eventually graduate than students who are off track. Now you may wonder, well, is this just because students who are on track have higher test scores or are advantaged in other ways? So what I'm going to do now is split that 4-year graduation rate chart up by students entering test scores. So if you look all the way to the right, you can see that students who enter 9th grade with very top test scores in the top quartile, these are very high test scores, most of them end their 9th grade year on track, about 78% of them, and of those students with high test scores who are on track, 90% graduate. Not surprising, they have high graduation rates. But over 1/5 of these students with very high test scores, 22%, ended their 9th grade year off track. And of those students with very high test scores who are off track, only 37% graduated. And in fact, those students were much less likely to graduate than students coming into 9th grade with very low test scores in the bottom, way over on the left, but who managed to be on track at the end of their freshman year, who passed their classes. Again, it just shows that, yes, test scores matter, but they matter because they make it easier for students to pass their classes, and it's that passing classes that really matters. Now, the on-track indicator itself is great for, an overall, forecasting of eventual graduation rates, but it's not so great to use for intervention because you can't calculate it until the end of the 9th grade year. But you don't have to, because it's based on students' course performance. You can actually look at their GPAs, you can look at their pass rates, and all the way from the first quarter of the year, which students are failing or at risk of failing. Right away you can intervene, and those are equally as good predictors of whether or not students will graduate. You can also look at their attendance, which is also strongly related, not quite as strongly related, but it also is a very good predictor. 9th grade attendance, very good predictor of whether students will graduate, and you can look at that all the way from the first week. So those can be used for early intervention. In the first study, in the 2007 study, we looked to see whether the relationships between on-track and eventual graduation held across different schools, by race, ethnicity, by gender, and we found that it did. Relationships were very similar no matter what school students went to, or their background characteristics, but we did not look by ELL status. So that's what Stacy is now going to talk to you about.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. So to give everyone an idea of what the ELL population across Chicago looks like, during the 2010-2011 school year, there were over 63,000 ELL students enrolled from pre-K through 12th grade in the Chicago public school system. Most of those were in elementary schools, but as Jennifer pointed out, the population in high schools is rising. And at any one point in time, about 15% of the CPS population are ELL. What we'll see in a couple of slides is that there's actually a much higher proportion of kids who are ever ELL across their whole career within the CPS system. So for this study, to be consistent with our previous reports, we're using a cohort of first-time 9th graders in the 2004-2005 year. And we followed those students for 5 years until the fall of 2009, when they should have graduated. In Chicago, prior to 2006, this just gives an overview of how students were identified as ELL. when a student enters the CPS system, every parent has to fill out a home language survey where they are asked 2 questions, whether there's a language other than English spoken in the home and whether the student speaks a language other than English. And if the parent responds yes to either of those questions, the student is tested with an English proficiency assessment. Back at that time, students were categorized into 4 proficiency levels. So 1 was the lowest level, all the way up to 4, indicating that they had achieved English proficiency. For us, we, in our analyses, we're considering any student who are in levels 1, 2, or 3 as being eligible for receiving ELL services. Also, back in 2004, students were entitled to 3 years of ELL services. That could be extended year by year until 5 years if the student needed it. But after 5 years, students could only receive those extra English supports if it was included in their IEP, and that's changed because of federal guidelines since then. When we began to look at high school ELLs, we noticed that they are a very diverse group of students, and this is beyond their race or ethnicity or their home language or the country that they were born in. So what we did was we grouped students based on their ELL status and when they achieved proficiency. We wanted to take these into account in order to understand these different students' outcomes. So we have 4 groups of ELL students that we'll be looking at throughout the rest of this presentation. The first 2 comprise of students who were currently ELLs when they were first-time 9th graders in 2004. Within there, we have 2 groups. One that we call new ELLs. These are students who first were identified as eligible for ELL services in the middle grades or in their 9th grade year. These are mostly newcomers into the system. We also have a group of students that we call long-term ELLs. Those were students who were designated as ELL before the middle grade years. So these are students who have been in the CPS system for many years, and a larger proportion of these students were identified as learning disabled as well as ELL. Our next 2 groups are our former ELLs, so students who had been ELL at some point in their school career but had achieved proficiency. The first of those groups we call recently proficient. So those are students who in the years leading up to or in 9th grade had just achieved proficiency. And then we have students who are long-term proficient. So these are students who achieve proficiency sometime during their elementary grades. And these are often most likely students who entered the system very early on in kindergarten and first grade, maybe even in preschool, and then achieved proficiency relatively quickly. This table just shows the percent of first-time freshmen in our cohort who are in each of these categories. And what we can see is actually that 28% of these first-time freshmen were ELLs at some point in their history in CPS. So it's almost double what any single point in time count is of ELLs. If you read across this table, what we're looking at is the ethnic breakdown within each category of students that we looked at. So between 63 and 86% of current ELLs and former ELLs are Hispanic. So as Julia mentioned, this is the largest ethnic group within CPS who are ELLs, and that's who we're going to focus on. When we look at our group of students who had never been ELL, 73% of those students are African American. So because we know that student outcomes differ by race and ethnicity, we opted to conduct within ethnicity comparisons. So when we talk for the rest of this presentation, we'll be comparing Hispanic new ELLs to Hispanic long-term ELLs and Hispanic former ELLs. As Julia mentioned, the report does also look at Asian and white ELLs, but many of our findings were similar for those groups. And then this just shows what the background characteristics are within each of these groups. In our particular sample, new ELLs, those who were newcomers, and the long-term ELLs differed in ways that might have put them at greater risk for dropping out of school. These are things that Jennifer had just been mentioning earlier. So there are just a few differences that I want to point out here. You can see here that the long-term ELLs were more likely to be a student with disabilities, so 45% of those students were also identified as having special needs. We also see that newcomers are twice as likely to be old for grade when they entered school compared to long-term proficient students. And there's a considerable amount of research that shows that students who enter high school at older grades are more likely to drop out. Are more likely to drop out. Research has also focused on how first and third generation students are more likely to drop out than second generation students. So new ELLs here we can see are more likely to be first generation, much less likely to be born in the United States. And finally, we see that new and long-term ELLs are less likely to be enrolled in selective enrollment high schools here in Chicago. It's not surprising. Many of the new ELLs were likely not in the school system in time to take tests for selective enrollment high schools, which are given in 7th grade here. And long-term ELLs are more likely to have learning disabilities, which would prohibit them from being accepted into a selective enrollment school. However, we did also look at the neighborhood high schools that these students attended, and they were more likely to go to lower performing neighborhood high schools than other students. So now I'm going to switch over to my colleague, Amber, who will talk about 9th grade course performance for these groups of students.
Hi. As Stacy said, I'm going to be talking about students' 9th grade course performance. We found that there were 3 tiers of performance among our Hispanic students, and the groups didn't necessarily fall into the tiers that one might think they would. So in the top tier, we had new ELLs and long-term proficient students. New ELLs, just to remind you, are those who are new to CPS. So we were actually a little surprised by the fact that they fell into the top tier. And long-term proficient students are those who were ELL at some point, but gained proficiency prior to a while before high school. Then in the middle tier, we had recently proficient students and students who were never ELL. And then at the bottom tier, we had students who were long-term ELLs, so those who entered CPS a long time ago as ELLs and have been ELLs ever since. So here we see that among Hispanic students, the new ELLs and long-term proficient students were much more likely to be on track at the end of 9th grade than the other groups. So about 64.5% of those two groups, students in those two groups were on track at the end of 9th grade, compared with 58% of never ELLs, 57% of recently proficient students, and 55% of long-term ELL students. In terms of their GPAs, once again, new ELLs and long-term proficient students had the highest GPAs at the end of their 9th grade year, just over a C average. Recently proficient students and never ELL students had about a C average, and then long-term ELLs had just under a C average. So not huge differences, but still falls into the same pattern. When we looked at the number of classes that that Hispanic students failed during their 9th grade year, we see that new ELLs failed just under 2 semester courses during their 9th grade year. And long-term proficient students failed about 2, so slightly more. The other 3 groups failed between 2.5 and just under 3 courses. So once again, very similar pattern to the other indicators. And then lastly, we looked at the attendance of Hispanic students, and we found that new ELLs missed about 6 days of school per semester in their 9th grade year. Long-term proficients missed about a day more per semester, and the other 3 groups missed around 9 days per semester during their 9th grade year. So now we're going to look at the graduation rates by course performance indicators. So in general, each of the course performance indicators are good predictors of graduation for all 5 groups of students. However, we found that current ELLs tended to have lower graduation rates overall. So here we see that long-term proficient students had the highest graduation rates among all of the Hispanic students, followed by never ELLs and recently proficient students. The 4th group in terms of graduation rates are new ELLs, and long-term ELL students were least likely to graduate. But as you'll recall, our new ELL students actually performed very well on their 9th grade course performance indicators, yet they're graduated at 11 percentage points lower. They were at rates 11 percentage points lower than the long-term proficient students. So we're going to see this pattern throughout this section, and Julia will actually address this later on in the presentation. We see here that on-track indicator is very predictive of which students are going to graduate 4 years later, regardless of which group they're in. So students who are on track are 3 to 3.5 times more likely to graduate than students who are off track at the end of their 9th grade year. And here we see that students with better GPAs are also much more likely to graduate than students with worse GPAs for each of our ELL categories. In fact, students with a 2.5 GPA or better were very likely to graduate in 4 years compared to students with a 1.5 who were very unlikely to graduate. Now, I want you to remember that for each of these, we're talking about this indicator for them in their 9th grade year. So students who passed all of their 9th grade classes were much more likely than students who failed 1 to 2 classes per semester to graduate. For each additional failure, they are less and less likely to graduate. This is true across the board for each of our groups of students. Students who missed under a week of school were likely to graduate, and students who missed 1 to 2 weeks of school were less likely to graduate. With each additional week of absences, they are less and less likely to graduate. This is once again true for each of our 5 groups of students. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Julia, who's going to talk about explaining differences in graduation rates.
Okay, so in the previous section, Amber showed us that course performance is highly predictive of graduation, both for our 2 groups of current ELLs, as well as our 2 groups of former ELLs. But she also highlighted the fact that at each level of course performance, the 2 groups of current ELLs had much lower graduation rates than, for example, long-term proficient students. So on this slide here, you can see that among students who passed all of their classes, who had 0 course failures, around 75% of new ELLs and long-term ELLs graduated in 4 years. But if you look at the set of columns second to from the right, you see that around 87% of long-term proficient students graduated who had passed all of their classes. So we see a disparity here. We know that the course performance indicators can be used to identify current ELLs who may be on the path to dropping out, but we do see some differences in graduation rates. And this suggests that there may be some other factors very distinctive to the experiences of current ELLs that may be influencing their graduation rates. So we decided to take a look at this. And in thinking about what those factors are, we looked at several different potential contributors to this. And so some of these, it could be the case that, as Stacy pointed out earlier, that some background characteristics of current ELLs, both these new ELLs and long-term ELLs, may have put them at higher risk of dropping out. So for example, we saw that new ELLs were more likely to be first-generation immigrants. We also saw that long-term ELLs were more likely to be male, and they were more likely to have be in special education. We saw that new ELLs, actually both groups tended to enter high school at older ages, and both groups also tended to go to academically weaker high schools than long-term proficient students. We also took a look at educational aspirations. So in the spring of 2005, in the spring of these students' 9th grade year, they completed a survey, and one of the questions that they were asked is, what is the highest level of education you plan to complete? And as you can see here on this chart, new ELLs and long-term ELLs, around 30% of these students did not plan to continue their education past high school. And that compares to only 10% of long-term proficient students. So there is a real difference here in terms of their educational aspirations. So we ran an analysis that examined each of these factors to determine which, if any, might explain differences in graduation rates between long-term proficient students and new ELLs, and then a separate analysis looking at the differences in graduation rates between long-term proficient students and long-term ELLs. And what we found is that what mattered most, what was the single most important factor contributing to lower graduation rates of new ELLs and long-term ELLs was the fact that they went to high schools that were academically weaker than the high schools attended by long-term proficient students. As you may recall, Stacy pointed out that they were much less likely to be in selective high schools, and they also went to neighborhood high schools where fewer students graduated overall. Other factors also turned out to be important in explaining the differences in graduation rates. So for long-term ELLs, the fact that a substantial portion of them had been in special education, and special education students do tend to drop out at higher rates. For new ELLs, the fact that they entered high school at older ages was also a relevant factor in explaining their lower graduation rates. And then for both groups of students, this issue around the fact that they had lower educational aspirations also was related to their lower graduation rates. It wasn't a huge factor, but it did play a role. So, just to kind of recap some of our major findings here, I think the most important finding that we really want to highlight from our work is the fact that 9th grade course performance is highly predictive of graduation for both current ELLs, 9th grade ELLs, and also students who were previously at ELL. This is a really important finding because it helps districts and schools know that if they're putting an early warning system into place, they can use indicators, they can use course performance indicators pretty much in the same way for ELL students to identify students who may be at risk of dropping out. Instead, as Elaine mentioned earlier, it's very cumbersome for schools to have to manage many different indicators. In many ways, a simpler system can be effective. So it's great to know that 9th grade course performance is highly predictive of graduation for current ELLs and former ELLs. It's also much more predictive of graduation than ELL-specific indicators. We didn't actually present this portion of our work here, but we did look at how well English proficiency, whether or not English proficiency mattered or was predictive of graduation. And it turned out that course performance was far better in predicting graduation than English proficiency. So another set of really important takeaways from this work is the fact that despite the fact that course performance is highly predictive of graduation, we did see that new ELLs and also long-term ELLs graduated at lower rates. So recall that new ELLs actually had pretty strong course performance, but they graduated at lower rates than we would have expected given that strong course performance. Long-term ELLs also graduated at lower rates given pretty weak course performance. And the single most important factor contributing to these lower graduation rates is the fact that they did go to academically weaker schools. And I think that this is really an important, this has really important policy implications. So Of course, it goes without saying that all students would benefit from there being more academically strong schools in the system. But in the interim, as districts work to improve opportunities for all students, it is possible that students who are still not proficient in English by high school could really benefit from more help from middle school counselors as they transition from middle school to high school. So in Chicago, for example, we have an open enrollment system. If neighborhood schools have space, then students can apply, put their name in the lottery, and they have a chance of being accepted into that school. But it is possible that students who still have not achieved proficiency may need additional help to navigate that process. It requires understanding how the lottery system works, submitting applications, etc. And although we certainly did not look at this, it may be the case, particularly for new ELLs, that their parents may not be as able to help them navigate their system. And so this really highlights the role that a counselor might be able to play for these two groups of students as they transition from middle school to high school. As I mentioned, we saw that for both students, educational aspirations also played a role in their lower graduation rates. This is really not something that we were able to understand completely in this report, but I think it could be an area for additional research, understanding why these students expected to finish their education earlier than other groups of students. And then it's also really important to acknowledge the importance that that for new ELLs, the fact that they entered high school at older ages also played a big role, or was a very important factor contributing to their lower graduation rates. And if you think about this, this really sort of makes sense. So students who enter high school at 15 or 16 only have a couple of years to accumulate credits towards graduation before their same age peers who started high school at 14 began to finish high school and move on to other opportunities. So this really may be an area, and this is an issue that is not ELL specific. There are many students who enter high school at older ages, mostly because they've been retained in earlier grades. But it's really an area where policymakers and school and district personnel could think about how they might handle the task of moving students through high school at a more rapid pace so they don't necessarily feel left behind when their same age peers are moving on and graduating. A couple of additional findings that I think are really important to note is the fact that long-term proficient students, sorry for the phone interruption, long-term proficient students actually had relatively good course performance. We really saw when we compared them to students who had never been ELL, we saw that they actually did a little bit better. And this suggests that for students who had at one point been ELL but had achieved proficiency by well before the middle grades, there was no long-term disadvantage to their having ever been ELL. I think it's important to acknowledge, Jennifer mentioned this briefly in her introduction, that I emphasize the word relatively because their overall course performance was not super strong. They ended ninth grade with a C or C+. I think it is really, I'd like to underscore her call for the need for further research around, moving beyond a high school graduation focus and really thinking about what ELL students need to achieve in high school in order to do well in college. And then finally, a finding that we saw was, and we didn't really talk about this too much, but we did find that students who had achieved proficiency just prior to high school actually did a little bit worse in their classes than long-term proficient students who had achieved proficiency much longer than that. And this was partially related to the fact that they had lower attendance and weaker study habits, but it is worth noting that districts really need to pay attention to students, to ELLs as they exit programs. How are they doing in their courses? Are they, do they need additional supports? Is there a possibility that students may have exited too early? As it happens in Chicago, after these I think in 2010, Chicago did increase its exit criteria. So they raised the score on the proficiency test that students needed to exit ELL status. So that sort of sums up some of our key findings. I'm going to turn it back to over to Joe at the National High School Center.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to the entire consortium research team. Before we move on to the next presentation, I want to briefly remind everybody to use the Q&A box or comment box on the right side of your screen to submit questions for to any members of the current panel and the previous presentation, and for Mindy as well, that we can address at the end of the other presentations. So let's go ahead and get started with Mindy talking about how this new research ties back to the early warning intervention and monitoring system.
Great, thanks, Joe. Given the magnitude of the dropout problem, as highlighted by Joe at the beginning of this session, and the diversity of needs identified both by Jennifer O'Day and those with the consortium, many states and districts and schools are using an early warning system to identify or predict which students are at risk of dropping out, and understanding the needs of those, or the unique needs of those students, and then to be able to accurately target resources to support those off-track students while they're still in school and before they drop out. And this is important, especially in today's environment in which funds are pretty limited in schools, and so schools really want to ensure that those limited resources that they have are targeted at the accurate, or the students with the most need. And also an early warning system tool enables schools to examine patterns and identify school climate issues or issues that are going on with subgroups of students. And so very similar to the type of analysis that the consortium has done, schools can really do at a micro level to understand how their different subgroups of populations are performing on the indicators that we can use to identify which students are or are not at risk of dropping out. So what are those indicators? On the screen you can see a table of indicators and thresholds that the National High School Center has summarized based on the research of the consortium in Chicago schools and others like Johns Hopkins or even Rel Midwest and alike. And just to quickly summarize, we've identified both a set of indicators and thresholds for the middle grades level and for the high school level. In middle grades, you'll see that the attendance of missing 20% or more of an instructional time and failing an English, language arts, or mathematics course is associated with being at risk of dropping out. At the high school level, those are a little bit different indicators. Here we see missing approximately 10% of instructional time, and then failure in one or more courses, earning a GPA of 2.0 or lower are all associated with dropping out. Also, and not on here is the, or as implied on here, is also the Consortium in Chicago Schools on-track indicator. And the on-track indicator, as defined by them, is failing one, or to be on track, a student needs to have failed one or less core courses and have a 2.0 or GPA or higher. Correct me if I'm wrong, Elaine or Julia. And so the High School Center has summarized this research and tried to provide some real actionable indicators and thresholds that schools can use to identify those students that are most at risk. And now we have confidence in that these are not only accurate for any student, but also specifically for students with disabilities and students that are English language learners. That's not to minimize that if a school, a state district or school can do local validation, that isn't powerful, enabling them to hone these indicators and thresholds for their specific context. It's also important to note that the implementation of an early warning system tool should be done systematically. So the National High School Center has developed the early warning intervention implementation and monitoring system, which is a 7-step process that enables schools to not only use a tool, but to ensure that students' needs are addressed by the findings and that those are monitored. So in this process, a team is responsible for all aspects of implementing the tool. And this committed team can be already existing team, sometimes like a school improvement team, or it could be a new team. And it's a team that's very knowledgeable not only of the interventions that are available at the school, but also the diverse student body. And this team together uses the indicators or a tool to identify those students that are at risk for dropping out, and then to understand the student and school level patterns in student engagement and academic performance. So looking at not only individual student behavior or data, but also patterns of data across different subgroups or across the whole school body. And then monitoring individual students' response to interventions to ensure that the interventions being given to those students are truly effective. And so using the same indicators that are used to actually identify students can be used to monitor those students' response to interventions. And also these can be used to evaluate to some degree the effectiveness of specific programs, so looking at those data in aggregate. Reflection and refinement on the process enables also the honing of indicators and thresholds, so schools can start to understand specifically what the thresholds may or may not be catching, or if they're missing students, and identifying strengths and weaknesses of the dropout prevention efforts in whole. Before we start taking questions about these presentations, I would also like to demonstrate a few features of the National High School Center's Early Warning System tool and how they can help schools and districts translate this research to practice. So, on the screen now, you can see the Early Warning System high school tool. And this is a Microsoft Excel-based tool that's available free of charge, and there's not only a high school center version, but also a middle grade version of the tool. The tool is Excel-based, although it's menu-driven, and in the tool, in the tool settings, you can identify you can set up the tool to reflect your local context, but it also enables within that for you to identify, I apologize, I'm trying to ensure that this is showing on your screen. I realize that there may be some delay. There. So it allows you to not only identify different components of your local context, the number of grading periods, the numbers of days in each grading period. If you're able to hone the indicators and thresholds, that can be done. Also, it enables you to, and I'll show in a minute, to disaggregate data by certain subgroups. So here in this portion of the tool that you can see on the screen, you can see that a school could identify how they classify not only students as being ELL or not, but in this example, which is fictitious, the school has 5 categories of ELL students, and so those categories are in the tool. And then within the tool, you can identify which of those students are ELL and fall into each of those categories. Why is this important? So we can actually start to not only look at our general student body and identify those specific students that are at risk, but we can start to examine those patterns of data associated with different subgroups as well. So after information is put into the tool about the local context and student performance, you can start to identify those students that are at risk of dropping out. This report here shows the name of students and their ID numbers, and then for those students that are flagged, it will identify the flag. It will identify the flag, and the student's name will be highlighted in red. On this report, interesting or nicely, is you can also just look at certain subgroups of students. So you could look at just your ELL students. And this gives not only be able to identify those that are at risk, but you can look at the data and start to examine if there's patterns across the data. A few other reports that I would like to show that are applicable for today's presentation. And we have both in the tool school-level reports and student-level reports. School-level reports are graphical representation of the data, where student reports actually name names. And as you can probably guess, there's lots of different uses for these. The school-level reports enable schools to look at trends in data and also allow them to present this information to a broader group of stakeholders that may not need to know specific student names. One of these reports is the Risk Indicator Summary Report for students with English language learners. And when I create this report, you can see graphical representation of students that are on and off track in this report. Those students that are not flagged are in light blue, and those that are flagged are in blue. And you can see the number of students by each category that have been identified. A very similar report, but a student-level report, is our flagged student report for English language learners. And this report lists those students that are English language learners that have been flagged during this time period, identifies what they've been flagged for, but also gives the ELL status. So you can begin to really understand what's going on for those different students and, again, examine those patterns of data. So, without any further delay, I would really like to turn it back over, or actually turn it over to Matt Honstein, a colleague of mine here at the National High School Center, who also works on the early warning system team, who is going to take some time to moderate the questions and answers.
Great, thank you, Mindy. We've had a lot of great questions both through the registration and coming into us during the presentation. I'd like to remind and encourage everyone to use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side to ask any additional questions you'd have. I'm going to start with the questions from the registration that weren't answered during the presentation and then move on to those coming in right now. So our first question is for the consortium. It appears from your presentation that new ELLs perform better than long-term ELLs. Could you elaborate on that distinction for us?
Sure. Can you all send the presentation mode back to us?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. So, as Amber alluded, we were somewhat surprised when we looked at ninth grade course performance to see that new ELLs did as well as they did in their classes. Just to remind you, they had they failed the fewest, on average, they failed the fewest number of classes. They had GPAs that were nearly comparable to long-term proficient students. They had the best attendance record and on-track rates that were as good as rates for long-term proficient students. And given the challenges that Jennifer mentioned that ELLs face, particularly at the high school level, we were somewhat surprised by the fact that they did relatively well in their classes. So in thinking through this answer, research has suggested that ELLs often end up on an ELL track. Typically, they're much more likely to take remedial classes. Expectations may be lower in these, teacher expectations may be lower in these classes. But certainly it could be the case that if they were more likely to take remedial classes, this could mean higher GPAs, lower course failures. It is possible that teachers might grade ELLs more leniently. But then the third theory that we also wanted to test was whether or not their relatively strong course performance was due to different academic behaviors. So the report that Elaine mentioned earlier, the original What Matters report, showed that some of the strongest predictors of overall GPA and course failures was whether or not students came to class regularly and whether or not they showed a strong commitment to studying. So to take you through each of these potential hypotheses, we started first by looking at the kinds of classes that students took. And I have to acknowledge that this chart is a little challenging to read, so I hope you'll bear with me. Just to give you some context, in the late 1990s, CPS moved to a college prep curriculum in which they eliminated nearly all remedial classes. In the 4 core subjects, they also specified classes that students had to take in order to graduate. So, for example, in math, for most students, they had to take algebra. Algebra was the necessary required class that they had to take to accumulate the credit for graduation. In social science, it was world studies. In science, most students took earth science or biology. And then in English was the only area where the required class was different for ELL students than it was for non-ELL students. So for non-ELL students, the required class was called Survey of Literature. But for ELL students, they could take an ESL class as their required English class. So with that in mind, we coded all of the classes that students took in their 4 core areas, and we coded them into remedial, of which there were hardly any. If students were taking the required class in that particular core subject, they were coded in this dark red color called required. It turned out that in math and English, in addition, students whose entering 8th grade test scores were below the national norm, they had to also take a support class. So in math, they could take two classes of algebra and then algebra support, and then in English it was the required class, and reading and language arts is the support class. So in any case, this diagram shows that in math, in social science, and science, new ELLs basically took the same kinds of classes as everyone else. Few students are taking remedial classes. Pretty much everybody is taking the same kinds of classes. English is the only area where we saw different course taking for new ELLs. So most students are taking ESL, and some of them are also taking, in addition to ESL, they're also taking a support class. So after we coded classes, we then looked at the patterns in GPA across these 4 subject areas. Our idea here was to see in the classes where new ELLs in the subjects where new ELLs took the same classes as other students, do we see the same pattern in subject-specific GPA as we saw overall? And in the one class, in English Language Arts, where they take different classes, does somehow the ESL GPA look much different? In other words, could that be inflating the overall GPA that we saw earlier? So the basic takeaway here is that we largely see the same pattern that we had observed earlier. So in math, science, and social studies, new ELLs are clearly doing better in their classes than long-term ELLs and also students who were never ELLs. They're doing a tick better than recently proficient students, and they're doing roughly similarly, a little bit less perhaps, or in actually social studies a little bit better than long-term proficient students. When we look at English Language Arts, we see that for new ELLs, their GPA in English is higher than in other subjects, except social studies. But that's roughly true for other groups overall. And we basically see the same pattern in GPA that we have seen in the other subject areas. So it does not look like the kinds of classes that students were taking had anything to do with the overall grades that they were receiving. So the next thing we looked at was academic behaviors. Just as by way of a reminder, we've already seen that new ELLs actually had the best attendance record. They only missed 6 days on average each semester, and that was better than any of the other groups that we looked at. We also looked at their study behaviors. So again, students in the spring of their 9th grade year took a survey, and they were asked 4 different questions about their homework habits. So I set aside time to do my homework and study. I try to do well on my schoolwork even when it isn't interesting. If I need to study, I don't go out with my friends, and I always study for tests. We combined the responses on these 4 items, and overall we found that new ELLs did substantially better than any other group of students that we looked at. These are in standard deviations. This is actually quite a big difference. And once you take into account their higher absences and study behaviors, that really explains why they did as well as they did in their classes. It does not appear that teachers were grading them more leniently. It really looks like their overall GPA was a reflection of the fact that they were coming to class more regularly and really showing a strong commitment to studying. That's that.
Great, thanks, Julia. And let me ask a follow-up question that came in during the presentation. You mentioned school setting and that ELLs attend lower performing high schools. Could you expand on that a little bit? For instance, are the schools themselves diverse and poor performing, or are the schools almost entirely ELL students?
So that's a really great question. It turns out that at least among the Hispanic population, most ELL students tend to be concentrated in 12 high schools, which is actually a relatively small number given the fact that there are around 100 high schools in the district. We did not look specifically to see if long-term proficient students were more, we did. They were more diversely spread out across the district, and they seemed to have access. They seemed to be more likely to choose to go outside of their attendance area at school. So they seemed to be, this is really only suggestive, but it seemed as if they were sort of negotiating the system of choice in Chicago a little bit better, as reflected in the sort of index that we use to measure school quality by.
Which was graduation rate.
Which was the overall high school graduation rate.
Great, thanks. Okay, Jennifer, we have a question for you here. What are best practices for ELLs who are identified as at risk? If we have level 1, should they be in separate classes and possibly more? And finally, what is your dream high school ELL program?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I wanted to actually, before I get to that, I wanted to make a comment about this couple of questions that you just asked the consortium folks. I think that one thing is that even though you might not see ELLs going into different kinds of classes, they may have better study habits and so forth. I think that, again, coming back to this issue of what kids actually learn in the classes and how well that prepares them, if they're going to academically less rigorous high schools, then those grades may have a different meaning by virtue of the high school as opposed to the individual course. And, I have some personal experience in this, having taught English learners in a post-secondary setting who graduated with fairly high, grades in their courses in high school and yet had just tremendous problems when they entered college. So just wanted to raise that. In terms of best practices, again, I think one of the things to keep in mind is the diversity of the English learner population. So what may be best practices for newcomers, recent immigrants, may not be so for long-term ELLs. And I think, as the question implies, what may be best practices for students at the lowest levels of proficiency may not be the appropriate practices for schools, for students at higher levels of proficiency. I do think, now I am quite frankly, more of my work has been focused on elementary and middle school. I have some familiarity with high school programs, but not as much as I would like. But there is, in the Understanding Language initiative that I talked about earlier, one of the things that we have been talking about is, especially in relationship to English language proficiency as well as in relationship to best practices, is concentrating on or having specific attention to English acquisition for lower level English learners and measuring that through English language proficiency assessments, and for higher levels incorporating it into attention through their other programs. So I do think there's some evidence for having concentrated attention to language acquisition for lower level students, although I'm not sure that there's strong evidence for separate classes. Maybe some additional type of services and intervention, but I don't know that the research is strong in support of separate classes for lower level English learners. I do know that in terms of the ideal setting, some schools that I think have really shown pretty significant results with newcomers in particular at the high school level would be the international high schools. There's, I think, about somewhere between 14 and 16 of these across the country. Most of them are in New York City, but we have one here in San Francisco and also one in Oakland. And they really do combine content learning with English language acquisition and have a pretty demanding set of courses for the students. And I think that they've had some pretty tremendous results. Clearly, one of the most important things I think in all of this is that the teachers of English learners actually have an understanding of second language acquisition and the interplay between language and content. And that's one of the big challenges because that is certainly not the case in most high schools across the country.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And I'd like to build on this a little bit with a question that we got for the consortium, which is, does Chicago Public Schools have a set of proven strategies to help ELL students become successful by the end of the 9th grade?
That is a great question and not one actually that I can really answer.
School by school.
Yeah, I really think that the programming around ELLs can vary quite substantially on a school by school basis. And it's not something that we were able to look at in this study.
Hello?
Sorry, thanks. We're out here. Thanks for that. Okay, I have an additional question for you. I know this isn't quite the topic of today, but I know you've done some work looking at students with disabilities as a subgroup. So do you think that given your research on both ELLs and students with disabilities that your indicators would be valid, universal for all student subgroups?
Yeah, they work in very much the same way. And I don't know if you noticed as Amber was going through those, if you look showing the relationship between GPA and failure to your 9th grade to eventual graduation, the differences between the different subgroups is very small relative to the differences between students with different number of failures or different GPAs or different attendance rates. The course performance just wants, student background characteristics in terms of the predictiveness of whether or not students will graduate. And we saw the same thing with students with disabilities, that again, the course performance indicators were very predictive. There were differences between the different groups, both in this report and the other report, but not in the relationships, but in the level, so that at each level of failures or GPA, students in some subgroups were less likely than those in others to graduate, although the indicators worked in much the same way. And again, the differences were much greater, by course performance than they were by subgroup with the same course performance. That said, with the students with disabilities, the big differences came for students with emotional behavioral disorders who had much lower levels of attendance, and as a result of that had much lower GPAs and higher course failures and were less likely to graduate.
Great, thank you. Changing gears a little bit, we have another question for Jennifer here. As the new Common Core standards go online, what should we be mindful of with respect to ELLs?
Great question, and I would recommend that people take a look at the Understanding Language website, which I don't have the address, but I think if you go to Understanding Language, put that in your browser, it will come up, because there's a set of papers kind of on this very topic. One of the most important things I think to realize is that the Common Core standards, as well as the Next Generation Science standards, all have a much higher demand for language than the current standards in most states. Not only in terms of, a lot of people think of it in terms of vocabulary, but the expectations for students with respect to participation in discourse and knowing kind of what the appropriate patterns are for that, and being able to handle the syntactic as well as vocabulary demands and the discourse patterns is just much more pronounced in the Common Core standards. The emphasis on communication in a variety of formats to a variety of audiences in ways that are specific to the disciplines, I think is just so central to these standards. And this has implications for English learners in particular, but it has implications for all students, and in particular for students who are also speakers of non-standard English and who live in poverty, who also have needs around language. But all students, one of the favorite things that I've heard recently is kids don't come into school speaking the language of mathematics. They actually have to learn it, and that's true for all kids. So having an understanding of the language components of the Common Core standards is I think, really important, and the ways those play out, particularly with respect to discourse.
Great, thank you. I have another question here for the consortium that came through the registration. A lot of the ELL research and today's presentation is geared towards Hispanic students, but our student population is 60% Chaldean refugees who speak Arabic. Do you have any suggestions, not only in regards to ELL students, but for students who are also refugees, and what do you think the implications of your research would be for these students?
That's a great question. We try to take into account some degree of diversity in ELL students' ethnic background. In the case of Chicago, as I mentioned earlier, Hispanic students are the overwhelming majority. We did do the same analyses for students who were identified as being white, which in the case of Arab students, they would have been identified as being white by CPS, and we also looked at Asian students. And we found, although the groups were small, we found exactly the same findings, that the course performance indicators generally worked very well for both of these groups of students. I think we do stress, though, this is really an area of research where replicating this study in other districts could be very important. I think it is really critical to understand there may be important differences. Our intuition is to say we feel very confident that that the indicators are likely to work across different populations. But we recognize even the Hispanic population in Chicago may be very different for than Hispanic populations in Texas or in California and New York. Now, in terms of the refugee question, I can't really answer that. I don't know how many students would have been considered refugee. I do think their experiences are likely to be very different. At least in terms of the research suggests that these are students who are likely to have big gaps in their educational experiences. If they come from countries that are experiencing war or major social or political unrest, they may have had, very large gaps in very significant interruptions in their education. We did not see, in terms of the Hispanic students that we studied, we did not see very big. We could only measure it in a limited way, so that was not our experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, even within our ethnic subgroups, we had, the vast majority of Hispanic students were from Mexico. The vast majority of white students are from Poland, Eastern Europe. The vast majority of Asian students from China. So we didn't even have enough students to look at differences by nationality within each ethnic group. And again, that's why it's so important to replicate the work in other places with different groups of ELLs.
And I think for certainly students who are refugees may have very different experiences coming into any sort of American school system, and that's certainly important to acknowledge.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, would you like to add anything or address a related question that we have, which is, what do you do to help a student who arrives with limited formal schooling at the age of 16, for example?
Yeah. Well, I think I think that for refugees and is that the term refugees or the kids who are refugees are also often students with interrupted formal education, SIFE students. The research, just in comment on the previous question, the research on SIFE students is really not very strong. In part, what you have are different definitions of what interrupted formal education is from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And also you have the problem of having sufficient numbers to actually show consistent patterns across these students. I think New York has a fairly large number of SIFE students, but that's not the case in a whole lot of places. Having worked with refugees myself, I would agree that the problems that they face, the issues, are often distinct from or magnified those of other students. Many of them come over and they are living with people. They may come over by themselves and not even have their family with them, and be living either with strangers or with relatives. They may have had just tremendously traumatic experiences before entering the United States, and all those kinds of things play into their educational experiences and their educational trajectories. However, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't find necessarily the same or a similar pattern with respect to course completions and grades and things like that in terms of the use of this early warning indicator. What it might mean is that the kinds of interventions that you need and the kinds of instruction that you need would look substantially different. And I think that is also the case when you're talking about school students that enter with very little formal education to begin with. And there, I think that there is a pretty strong case for having some kind of newcomer program that focuses on not only academic learning, but really on socialization, on a lot of the precursor skills, on really integrating students into the high school setting. And of course, it's very difficult for those students to acquire the credits needed for graduation. So having some sort of flexibility there in terms of the time and in terms of the opportunities that are available for students, I think is critically important. I would suggest taking a look at the work of the international high schools and that network because I think because they only work with relatively recent immigrants, a number of whom will be students with limited formal education. I think having familiarizing oneself with some of the strategies that they use might be particularly helpful.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And as we only have a couple minutes left, I'd just like to ask both our presenters, starting with Jennifer, if they have any final comments they'd like to share.
I think that what I would say, just kind of in wrapping, I think that the work that the consortium has done is really important and useful, and having read several iterations of it, I continue to feel that way. I think that looking at early warning indicators can be incredibly useful. I would add a couple of caveats. One would be that sometimes ninth grade's too late, that some EL kids, a fairly good number of EL kids, will drop out before they reach the ninth grade. So trying to have an understanding of what happens in middle school is also very important. And again, I would iterate that graduation, while it is critically important, does not necessarily imply readiness for either college or a career. The very low incidence of Hispanic students in college, I think, is in some part a testament to that. That may be related, as the consortium folks say, to aspirations. But I think it's also related to the level of preparation and, as they say, the kind of schools that many of these kids are funneled into. I think as we move to higher standards, we need to be particularly cognizant of that and pay special attention to both the language and the cultural demands of the Common Core standards, for example.
Great, thank you. Consortium, would you like to add anything?
I just want to build off what Jennifer said on the college going. That as a consortium, we've done a lot of work looking at students' college going and college graduation tied into their high school records. And it's interesting, just like we said that there are these large high school effects on graduation, there are also very large high school effects on college going in terms of the degree of support students are getting around preparing for college, applying to college, and then actually going to college, getting into college even after they've been accepted. And especially for Latino students, especially for English language learners, having really strong supports at the school makes a huge difference. And so again, getting into the better high schools that are more college-oriented makes a huge difference for English language learners. Julia, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to just go in a slightly different direction and say it's really been wonderful for us to collaborate with the National High School Center. We take very seriously the charge to do research that is highly applicable to and highly useful to Chicago's public schools and also to districts nationally. But really, the National High School Center has taken our research and transformed it into a very useful tool that schools can use to really try to tackle a very important problem, which is the fact that there are many students who don't graduate from high school. So for us, this has been a really terrific collaboration and one that, hopefully in other ways will continue to occur.
Thanks, Julia. The feeling is definitely mutual. We have enjoyed the collaboration on both reports, and we hope to continue to explore other opportunities to work together in the near future. I do want to thank the rest of the Chicago Consortium team, Elaine, Amber, and Stacy as well, and from the AIR team, Jennifer, Mindy, and Matt. In conclusion, I want to share with you some resources that you may want to visit as soon as possible. They're also located, and you can go there immediately through the links located in the comment section on the right side of your computer. I want to call your attention again to the tools themselves, our high school and middle grade tools. They're available free of charge, downloadable from the website at the link you see. We also have a set of implementation guides, technical guides, some research reports, and recordings of previous webinars. The recording of this webinar will be available on the site in the next day or so. And then I also want to call your attention to our new community of practice. You can reach it through the link on the screen as well. We will be continuing some of the discussions and address some of the questions we were unable to reach today through this new community of practice. Finally, I want to call your attention to some of our other social media that you can visit as well to get information about the high school center, as well as other resources, including a copy of the report that we've been talking about today. And finally, I want to thank all the participants for your interest in this topic, for your great questions, and most of all, for your continuing support and interest in the welfare and the progress of English language learners. Thank you very much.